For decades, there existed within the most exclusive circles of American power a man whose mere presence in a room guaranteed that conversations would become more discreet, that glances would turn more calculating, that the very air would seem charged with that particular tension that only accompanies those who possess secrets capable of destroying empires. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was not simply wealthy, though his fortune was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. He was not simply well-connected, though his contact book included presidents, prime ministers, Nobel laureates, technology magnates, and members of royal families. He was something more complex, more disturbing, more difficult to categorize. He was a man who had built his power precisely upon the impossibility of others fully understanding where that power came from, and who had turned that ambiguity into his greatest strength and eventually his undoing. To understand how such an elaborate protection system could collapse so spectacularly, it is first necessary to comprehend the magnitude of what that system protected. At his peak, Jeffrey Epstein inhabited a world that most people can only imagine through films or novels. His primary residence was a 7-story mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, one of the largest private properties in the city, acquired under circumstances that were never fully explained for a price that defied real estate market logic. The house had previously belonged to Les Wexner, the founder of L Brands and owner of Victoria's Secret, who had transferred it to Epstein in an arrangement whose exact terms remain shrouded in mystery to this day. It was a residence designed not only to impress, but to subtly intimidate, with its hallways adorned with contemporary art, its multiple floors of entertainment spaces, and that omnipresent sense that every corner had been designed to project a specific message about the power and taste of its owner. But the Manhattan mansion was just the beginning. Epstein also owned an estate of more than 30,000 square meters in Palm Beach, Florida, a property that would eventually become the epicenter of his first legal downfall. He had a ranch of thousands of hectares in New Mexico, but where he supposedly planned mass insemination experiments to propagate his genetic material, a fantasy that revealed the depth of his megalomania. He owned an apartment in Paris, in one of the most exclusive areas of the French capital. And perhaps most emblematic of all, he owned a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a territory that locals came to know by names that hinted at what happened behind its walls. Little St. James officially, but referred to by many as Orgy Island or, more darkly, Pedophile Island. It was a personal archipelago of privilege where the normal rules of society seemed not to apply, where visitors arrived by private helicopter or on Epstein's personal jet, and where what happened remained hidden from public scrutiny by layers of security, confidentiality agreements, and the tacit complicity of those who preferred not to ask questions. Epstein's private jet, a Boeing 727 that came to be known as the Lolita Express, in reference to Nabokov's novel about a man obsessed with a young girl, was itself a symbol of his status and of the shadows that surrounded him. The flight logs of that aircraft would become explosive documents years later, revealing the names of passengers that included some of the world's most recognized figures. Bill Clinton flew on that plane on multiple occasions, according to the records, though his representatives always insisted that those trips were related to philanthropic activities and that the former president was unaware of any improper conduct by Epstein. Donald Trump, who would later become president, had publicly described Epstein as a terrific guy and had acknowledged that they shared a taste for young women, though his defenders argued that those comments were made before accusations against Epstein became public. Prince Andrew of England was a frequent visitor to both the jet and Epstein's various properties, an association that would eventually destroy his reputation and force him to withdraw from public life, Prominent scientists, academics from elite universities, figures from the financial world, all appeared in those flight logs. All had accepted the hospitality of a man whose sources of income no one could clearly explain. And because that was perhaps the most persistent mystery surrounding Jeffrey Epstein, no one knew exactly where his money came from. Officially, he was a financial manager, someone who administered the fortunes of ultra-wealthy clients. But unlike other wealth managers of his supposed caliber, Epstein had no visible firm, no known employees in significant numbers, no corporate structure that could be audited or examined. His only known client was Les Wexner, the retail magnate, and the exact nature of that relationship was never fully transparent. There were those who speculated that Epstein was actually an intelligence operative, that his real function was to collect compromising information on powerful figures for some government agency. Others suggested he was simply a sophisticated conman who had managed to convince enough people of his financial genius to keep the illusion functioning. And then there were those who believed his real business was precisely what would eventually destroy him: the trafficking and sexual exploitation of minors, and that his wealth came from extorting the powerful who had participated in his crimes. What no one could deny was the reality of his connections. Epstein had cultivated over decades a network of relationships that spanned virtually every sphere of American and global power. In the academic world, he had donated millions to Harvard, and other elite institutions, buying access to some of the world's most brilliant thinkers, and, perhaps more importantly, buying the legitimacy that those associations conferred. In the scientific world, he had funded research on topics ranging from artificial intelligence to cryogenics, always positioning himself as a visionary patron interested in humanity's future. In the philanthropic world, he had established foundations and participated in initiatives that allowed him to rub shoulders with other billionaires at events where saving the world was discussed. In each of these spaces, Epstein presented himself not as what he was, but as what he wanted others to believe he was: a self-taught genius, an enlightened philanthropist, a man whose wealth and connections were simply the natural result of his exceptional intelligence and vision. The construction of this image had begun decades earlier, when Epstein was a young mathematics and physics teacher at the Dalton School in Manhattan, one of the country's most exclusive educational institutions. He had no university degree, a notable anomaly at a school of that caliber. But he had managed to convince someone that his natural talent was sufficient to compensate for the lack of formal credentials. It was at Dalton that Epstein made his first important connections, where he began to cultivate the art of impressing powerful people with his apparent brilliance and his willingness to be useful in ways that others were not willing to be. The father of one of his students was an executive at Bear Stearns, the investment bank, and it was through that connection that Epstein made the leap from education to finance, entering Wall Street without the credentials normally required for such positions. At Bear Stearns, Epstein rose with a speed that surprised his colleagues. He had a talent for making himself indispensable, for identifying what powerful people needed and positioning himself as the solution to those problems. Eventually, he became a limited partner of the firm, though the exact circumstances of that rise and his subsequent departure were never fully clear. What is documented is that after leaving Bear Stearns, Epstein established his own financial management firm, an operation that supposedly only accepted clients with net worths exceeding $1 billion. It was a bold claim, impossible to verify, and it contributed to the mystique that Epstein carefully cultivated. If he was selective enough to reject ordinary millionaires, he must be extraordinarily talented. If billionaires trusted him with their fortunes, he must be worthy of that trust. The logic was circular, but it worked precisely because no one could or would examine it too closely. During the 1990s and the first decade of the new millennium, Epstein consolidated his position at the apex of American society. He was a regular guest at the most exclusive dinners, at the most prestigious charity galas, at the retreats where the truly powerful gathered away from public view. He had perfected a personal style that combined calculated informality with subtle signals of extreme wealth. He dressed casually but in garments that connoisseurs recognized as extraordinarily expensive, and he spoke about scientific and philosophical topics with an ease that impressed non-experts. And he exhibited a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but which, in the circles where he moved, was interpreted as the natural security of someone who had reached the top on his own merit. But beneath this brilliant surface, something much darker was happening. The first warning signs began to emerge in the early years of the new millennium, though they were systematically ignored, minimized, or actively suppressed. In Palm Beach, where Epstein spent much of his time, local police began receiving complaints about suspicious activities at his mansion. Young women, many of them clearly minors, were seen entering and leaving the property at all hours. Neighbors observed patterns they found disturbing, though few dared to articulate exactly what concerned them. It was easier not to think too much about it, not to get involved, not to risk accusing such an obviously powerful man of something so unthinkable. The formal investigation began in March 2005, when the mother of a 14-year-old girl contacted the Palm Beach police to report that her daughter had been taken to Epstein's mansion and paid to provide sexual services. What followed was an investigation that, by all standards, should have resulted in the total destruction of Jeffrey Epstein. Detectives discovered a systematic pattern of abuse involving dozens of victims, many of them minors, recruited through a network of intermediaries who were often themselves previous victims. The modus operandi was consistent. Young women from humble backgrounds were lured with promises of easy money for giving massages to the wealthy mansion owner. Once inside, the massages escalated to sexual contact, and the victims were pressured to recruit other young women, creating a pyramid of exploitation that fed itself. The Palm Beach police compiled a case they considered solid. They had interviewed multiple victims, documented behavioral patterns, established the existence of a systematic abuse operation. But when they presented their evidence to the Palm Beach County Prosecutor's Office, they began to encounter obstacles they had not anticipated. State Attorney Barry Krischer showed himself curiously reluctant to prosecute the case with the aggressiveness that the evidence seemed to warrant. Instead of filing serious charges related to the sexual exploitation of minors, his office initially considered only a minor prostitution charge, treating the adolescent victims as consenting prostitutes rather than as girls exploited by an adult predator. The Palm Beach police, frustrated by what they perceived as an unwillingness to pursue the case properly, made the unusual decision to take their evidence directly to the FBI. It was a move that reflected their conviction that something was interfering with the normal process of justice at the local level, and that perhaps federal authorities would be less subject to the pressures that seemed to be affecting the county prosecutor's office. The FBI initiated its own investigation, which confirmed and expanded upon the local police findings. They identified more than 30 victims, documented interstate flights that could constitute violations of federal laws against sexual trafficking, and built a case that, according to many observers, justified serious federal charges that could have resulted in a life sentence. What happened next would become one of the most cited examples of how the justice system can function radically differently for the rich and powerful than for ordinary citizens. Instead of proceeding with a federal indictment that reflected the gravity of the documented crimes, the case was diverted to negotiations that resulted in what can only be described as an extraordinarily favorable agreement for Epstein. Alexander Acosta, then federal prosecutor for the Southern District of Florida, oversaw the negotiations that produced this agreement, and the decisions he made during that process would haunt his career for more than a decade, eventually costing him his position as Secretary of Labor in the Trump administration. The agreement reached in 2008 was so unusual that even other federal prosecutors expressed astonishment when its terms became public. Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state prostitution charges, one of which involved a minor. In exchange, he and any named or unnamed co-conspirators received immunity from any federal charges. The sentence was 18 months in the Palm Beach County Jail, but even this relatively light penalty was implemented in a way that defied any normal concept of incarceration. Under a work release program, Epstein was permitted to leave jail 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, to go to work at an office he had established specifically for this purpose. In practice, he spent most of his time outside jail, in a comfortable air-conditioned space where he could receive visitors, make phone calls, and continue managing his affairs, as if the imprisonment were little more than a minor inconvenience. The victims were not informed of the agreement before it was finalized, a violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act that would eventually be recognized by a federal judge. Many of them learned of the terms of the agreement only after it had already been implemented, and their outrage was understandable. They had cooperated with authorities, had relived painful traumas in interviews and statements, had trusted that the justice system would provide them with some measure of accountability, only to discover that the man who had abused them had received what amounted to a slap on the wrist. Questions about why Epstein received such favorable treatment began to emerge immediately, though they would take years to receive sustained public attention. Alexander Acosta, when questioned about his role in the agreement during his confirmation hearing as Secretary of Labor in 2017, offered an explanation that many found unsatisfactory. He suggested he had been told to leave the case alone, that Epstein belonged to intelligence and was above his pay grade. It was an extraordinary claim that Acosta never fully elaborated upon, and it raised more questions than it answered. If Epstein really had connections to intelligence services, which countries? And what kind of activities was he performing for them that would justify protection of this magnitude? The legal team that represented Epstein during these negotiations was a who's who of the American legal establishment. Kenneth Starr, the independent counsel whose investigation had led to Bill Clinton's impeachment, was part of the team. Alan Dershowitz, the prominent Harvard law professor and media commentator, also represented Epstein. Jay Lefkowitz, a lawyer with deep Republican connections, who had served in the George W. Bush administration, participated in the negotiations. It was a team designed not only to provide competent legal representation, but to send a message about the kind of power Epstein could mobilize in his defense. These were not lawyers that any defendant could hire. They were figures whose mere presence suggested that touching Epstein would have consequences. The negotiations between this legal team and the federal prosecutor's office proceeded in ways that, when revealed years later, scandalized legal observers. There were in-person meetings between Epstein's lawyers and prosecutor Acosta that were not properly documented. There were communications that seemed to treat Epstein not as a criminal defendant, but as an equal party in a business negotiation. The tone of the revealed correspondence suggested a deference toward Epstein and his team that was unusual in cases of this nature. And the final result, that extraordinarily favorable agreement, seemed to confirm that concerns about Epstein's influence were not paranoia, but a realistic assessment of how power functioned in his case. After the 2008 agreement and the brief period of incarceration that followed, Jeffrey Epstein registered as a sex offender, an illegal requirement that should have marked the end of his access to elite circles. But the reality was very different. Although some doors closed, many others remained open, and Epstein continued his social and professional life with a normality that was disturbing, given the nature of the crimes to which he had pleaded guilty. He continued receiving prominent visitors at his Manhattan mansion. He continued attending high-profile events, and he continued cultivating his relationships with scientists, academics, and figures from the financial world. This continuity is perhaps the most revealing aspect of the protection system that surrounded Epstein. Despite his conviction, despite his status as a registered sex offender, despite the accusations that had been documented in public records, many powerful people chose to maintain their association with him, and the reasons varied. Some perhaps genuinely believed that the accusations were exaggerated or that Epstein had paid his debt to society. Others perhaps had darker reasons for keeping Epstein close, related to what he might know about their own activities. And others simply operated in a world where a billionaire's conviction for sex crimes was treated as a public relations problem rather than a fundamental moral issue. And what the years between 2008 and 2018 represent a period of what could be called scandal normalization. Epstein had been exposed, convicted, and technically punished, but the system that protected him had proven robust enough to absorb that blow and continue functioning. The victims who had spoken found that their courage had not resulted in the justice they expected. Journalists who had investigated the case saw their stories published and then fade without generating the consequences that seemed warranted. The system seemed to have collectively decided that Epstein was too connected, too dangerous to challenge, too integrated into the structures of power to be truly brought down. But protection systems, however robust they may seem, depend on a balance of factors that can shift in ways that participants do not anticipate. And beginning in 2017, that balance began to shift in ways that would eventually make protecting Epstein not just unnecessary, but actively dangerous for those providing it. The initial catalyst was the MeToo movement, which transformed the public conversation about sexual abuse and power in ways that would have been difficult to predict even a year earlier. The MeToo movement did not arise from nowhere, but its explosion into public consciousness in October 2017, with the revelations about Harvey Weinstein, marked a cultural turning point. Suddenly, accusations that had been dismissed or minimized for decades were being taken seriously. Powerful men who had operated with impunity for years were being exposed, losing their positions, facing consequences. The calculus that had protected figures like Epstein, the presumption that his power was sufficient to silence his accusers, was no longer valid in the same way. Victims were finding a collective voice, and the public was demonstrating a willingness to believe them that had not existed before. In this transformed context, the Jeffrey Epstein case began receiving renewed attention. Journalists who had investigated the story years earlier and found their editors reluctant to publish now found a more receptive environment. The Miami Herald, in particular, began an exhaustive investigation led by journalist Julie K. Brown, which would eventually result in a series of articles that reignited the Epstein scandal and put it before a much wider public audience than any previous coverage. The Miami Herald series, published in November 2018, did not reveal fundamentally new information about Epstein's crimes. What it did was compile and present that information in a way that was impossible to ignore. Brown interviewed 80 victims and witnesses, reconstructed the timeline of the abuses, documented the failures of the justice system, and put faces and names to the young women who had been exploited. The series humanized the victims in a way that previous coverage had not achieved, presenting them not as statistical abstractions, but as real people whose lives had been devastated by a predator who had received what amounted to impunity. The impact of the Miami Herald series was amplified by the context in which it appeared. In the post-MeToo era, there was a public hunger for stories of the powerful finally being confronted with the consequences of their actions. The Epstein case, with its combination of extreme wealth, elite connections, and an evident failure of the justice system, was almost tailor-made to capture the public imagination. Social media amplified the story, carrying it beyond the traditional audience of a regional newspaper. Public figures began to be questioned about their past associations with Epstein. And crucially, federal prosecutors in New York began paying attention. The Southern District of New York, often described as the most prestigious prosecutor's office in the country, had its own history with the Epstein case. Years earlier, they had declined to prosecute, leaving the case in the hands of their Florida colleagues. But the Miami Herald revelations, combined with the change in the political and cultural climate, created pressure that was difficult to ignore. In 2019, the office opened a new investigation, seeking to determine whether there were grounds for federal charges not covered by the 2008 immunity agreement. The decision to proceed with a new federal investigation reflected a fundamental shift in the risk calculus surrounding Epstein. For years, protecting him, or simply not pursuing him, had been the lowest risk option for the institutions involved. Pursuing him aggressively meant potentially alienating powerful figures, facing a legal team with unlimited resources, and risking the consequences that Epstein might unleash if he felt cornered. But now, the calculus had inverted. Not pursuing him had become dangerous. Public attention was too intense, questions too persistent, the reputational risk of appearing to protect a sexual predator too high. This shift in institutional incentives is perhaps the key to understanding the collapse of Epstein's protection system. It was not that people in positions of power suddenly developed a moral conscience they had previously lacked. It was not that the evidence against Epstein became more solid than it had been in 2008. What changed was the environment in which decisions about Epstein were made. Protecting him stopped being neutral or advantageous and became a liability. And when protection becomes more costly than exposure, protection systems collapse. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey upon returning from Paris on his private jet. The federal charges filed against him included sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of minors, with potential penalties that could result in decades of imprisonment. Unlike the 2008 situation, this time there would be no favorable plea negotiation, no immunity agreements for unnamed co-conspirators, no sentences served in the comfort of an air-conditioned office. The system that had once protected him was now turning against him with all its force. The indictment revealed the breadth of Epstein's operation in ways that the 2005 to 2008 investigation had not managed to communicate to the public. It described a recruitment network that operated across multiple states, a pattern of behavior extending over years, and an infrastructure specifically designed to facilitate the abuse of minors. The Manhattan mansion, which prosecutors searched after the arrest, revealed additional evidence. Hundreds of photographs of young women, including some who appeared to be minors, stored in a safe alongside compact discs labeled with names and the word miscellaneous. Epstein's bail request was denied, a decision that reflected both the seriousness of the charges and the perception that he represented a flight risk. His lawyers had offered bail of more than $500 million, backed by his properties, and with the promise of constant electronic monitoring. But Judge Richard Berman determined that no combination of conditions could adequately guarantee that Epstein would appear for trial. He had too many resources, too many international connections, too much motivation to flee. For the first time in his life, Jeffrey Epstein faced the real prospect of consequences that his wealth and power could not avoid. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where Epstein was detained while awaiting trial, was a brutal contrast to the luxury residences he was accustomed to. It was a facility known for its difficult conditions, its overcrowding, the staffing problems that affected its ability to adequately monitor inmates. Epstein was initially placed in a special housing unit, where high-profile prisoners were supposedly kept under closer surveillance. But even this precaution would prove insufficient for what was to come. On July 23, 2019, Epstein was found semi-conscious in his cell, with marks on his neck. The incident was classified as a possible suicide attempt, though Epstein supposedly claimed he had been attacked by another inmate. He was placed on suicide watch, a designation that required constant monitoring and conditions designed to prevent any act of self-harm. But after approximately a week, he was removed from suicide watch, a decision that would be intensely questioned in light of subsequent events. On August 10th, 2019, at approximately 6:30 in the morning, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death, determined after an autopsy performed by the City of New York's chief medical examiner, was suicide by hanging. Epstein had supposedly hanged himself using his bedsheets, tying them to the upper bunk of his cell, and letting himself fall forward with enough force to cause fractures in several bones of his neck. And the circumstances of Epstein's death immediately generated suspicions that persist to this day. The two guards who were supposed to check on him every 30 minutes had not made their rounds. Both supposedly had fallen asleep and then falsified records to cover up their negligence. The surveillance cameras covering the area near Epstein's cell had supposedly malfunctioned, and the available footage was unusable. The cellmate who had been assigned to Epstein had been transferred the day before, leaving him alone despite his recent history of a possible suicide attempt. Each of these factors, taken individually, could be explained as the result of institutional negligence and lack of resources. Taken together, they created a picture that many found difficult to accept as mere coincidence. Theories about what really happened in that cell proliferated immediately. Some believed Epstein had been murdered to silence him, and to prevent him from revealing what he knew about powerful figures who had participated in his crimes. Others argued that he had genuinely committed suicide, finally confronted with the reality that there would be no escape, that he would spend the rest of his life in prison, that his carefully constructed reputation was irreparably destroyed. A medical examiner hired by Epstein's family, pathologist Michael Baden, suggested that the fractures in Epstein's neck were more consistent with strangulation than hanging, fueling murder theories. But the official medical examiner maintained his conclusion of suicide, and no subsequent investigation has produced conclusive evidence of foul play. What is perhaps more significant is not the irresolvable question of exactly how Epstein died, but what his death revealed about the system that had surrounded him for decades. That system, when it functioned to protect him, had been extraordinarily efficient. It had cushioned scandals, facilitated favorable legal agreements, kept elite doors open even after his conviction. But that same system, when it turned against him, proved equally efficient in abandoning him. In the days and weeks before his death, Epstein found himself completely isolated from the world of privilege in which he had lived. His former friends and associates rushed to distance themselves from him. His bank accounts were being examined. His properties were being searched. People who had once sought his company now fled from any association with him as from a plague. Epstein's protection system had not functioned because he was especially worthy of protection. It had functioned because, for a time, protecting him served others' interests. It provided them access to his network, his financing, his hospitality, while it protected them from the possibility that Epstein might reveal compromising information about them if he felt threatened. It allowed them to maintain the fiction that they did not know what was happening, that the young women they saw at his parties were simply assistants or models or adult companions. As long as these benefits outweighed the costs of association, protection would continue. But when costs began to outweigh benefits, when association with Epstein became a liability rather than an asset, protection evaporated with a speed that would have been unthinkable years before. Figures who had been photographed with him, who had flown on his plane, who had accepted his hospitality, suddenly did not remember him, had barely known him, certainly had no idea what he did. Institutions that had accepted his donations discovered there had never been a significant relationship, that the money would be returned or redirected, that any association had been a mistake being corrected. The speed of this collective disconnection was revealing. It demonstrated that the loyalty Epstein had purchased had never been genuine, that it had simply been a transaction that continued while convenient. Epstein's death did not end the legal consequences of his crimes. Ghislaine Maxwell, his closest associate and supposed principal recruiter, was arrested in July 2020 and subsequently convicted of sex trafficking and other charges, facing decades in prison. Prince Andrew of England reached a civil settlement with one of Epstein's accusers, Virginia Giuffre, on terms that were not disclosed, but were estimated in the millions of dollars. Civil lawsuits against Epstein's estate resulted in payments to dozens of victims through a compensation program established specifically for that purpose. Each of these consequences represented a form of accountability that had eluded Epstein in life, a belated demonstration that the justice system could function even when it had failed so spectacularly for so many years. But the broader questions about how Epstein had operated with such impunity for so long remain without satisfactory answer. The federal investigation that was underway at the time of his death never went to trial, meaning there was never a public process where the evidence was fully examined, where witnesses were interrogated under oath, where a legal record of what had happened was established. The names of powerful figures who supposedly participated in Epstein's crimes or helped cover them up were never revealed in an official context. The information Epstein might have provided about his co-conspirators, had he lived to testify, died with him. This is perhaps the most disturbing consequence of how the Epstein case ended. Not with a definitive conclusion that provided justice and clarity, but with a void that allows questions to persist indefinitely. Who were the powerful men who abused the young women Epstein provided them? What institutions knew what was happening and chose to look away? What protection mechanisms worked to keep him safe for so long? And who were the architects of those mechanisms? These questions have become fuel for conspiracy theories of all kinds, some plausible, others fantastic, none verifiable with the evidence currently available to the public. What we do know, based on the documented record, is enough to be profoundly disturbing. We know that the justice system systematically failed Epstein's victims, treating them in many cases as delinquents or accomplices, rather than as girls exploited by an adult predator. We know that powerful figures in the legal, financial, and political worlds maintained relationships with Epstein, even after his conviction, normalizing his presence in circles where he should not have been welcome. And we know that institutions that should have protected his victims, from the schools that provided access to vulnerable young people, to the agencies that should have investigated more aggressively, repeatedly failed to fulfill their responsibilities. And we know that when he finally faced significant consequences, Epstein died under circumstances that, at minimum, reflected extraordinary institutional negligence. The story of Jeffrey Epstein is ultimately a story about power and its limits. For decades, Epstein demonstrated that enough wealth, enough connections, enough information about others' transgressions could create an almost impenetrable bubble of protection. He operated in plain sight, making no real effort to hide his preferences for young women, and the system tolerated him because the cost of challenging him exceeded the benefit of protecting his victims. But that equation, like all equations of power, was contingent on factors that could change. And when they changed, when the cultural climate transformed, when public pressure became unsustainable, when association with him became political poison, the same system that had protected him abandoned him with the same efficiency with which it had previously defended him. This suggests something important about how elite protection systems work. They are not conspiracies in the traditional sense, with secret meetings and coordinated plans. They are rather emergent, the result of many individual decisions that, taken together, produce a systemic effect. Each person who chose not to investigate Epstein's activities too deeply, each institution that decided his money was too valuable to reject, each prosecutor who determined that facing his legal team was too risky, contributed to a protection system without necessarily coordinating with others to create it. And when conditions changed, each of these same people and institutions made new individual decisions that, taken together, produced the system's collapse. This understanding does not make what happened less disturbing, but perhaps makes it more comprehensible. We do not need to postulate a massive conspiracy to explain why Epstein was protected for so long. We only need to understand how incentives function in systems where power is concentrated and where accountability is selective. The powerful protect other powerful people, not out of abstract loyalty, but out of concrete calculations of self-interest. And when those calculations change, protection changes too. Epstein was not betrayed in the sense that someone who owed him loyalty chose not to provide it. He was abandoned when the cost of maintaining him became greater than the cost of letting him fall. The victims of Jeffrey Epstein, whose suffering was real and lasting regardless of analyses about power systems, deserve to be remembered as the center of this story. They were, for the most part, young women from humble backgrounds, allured by promises of money and opportunities, exploited by a system designed to turn their vulnerability into advantage for the predator. Many of them fought for years to be heard, facing a legal system that treated them with suspicion, a society that blamed them for their own victimization, and a perpetrator whose wealth and connections seemed to make him untouchable. When they finally received something approximating justice, it was late, incomplete, and overshadowed by the death of the principal defendant before he could be publicly tried. Epstein's legacy extends beyond his individual crimes. His case exposed the fissures in systems supposedly designed to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. It demonstrated how wealth can buy not only material luxuries, but also practical impunity. It revealed the willingness of apparently respectable institutions to accept money without asking uncomfortable questions about its origin. And it provided a vivid example of how changes in the cultural climate can transform what is politically possible, turning cases that seemed closed into scandals that dominate headlines. The reforms that emerged from the Epstein case, including legislation to strengthen victims' rights and changes in how institutions handle donations from controversial figures, represent some progress. But the underlying structures that allowed Epstein to operate for so long remain largely intact. Extreme wealth still confers extraordinary advantages in the legal system. Institutions are still susceptible to the influence of generous donors, and the powerful still have access to forms of protection that are beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. The question with which we began, about when the system stopped protecting Jeffrey Epstein, has multiple answers depending on how one defines system and protection. The formal legal system stopped protecting him when New York prosecutors decided that the costs of not prosecuting him exceeded the costs of confronting him. The elite social system stopped protecting him when association with him became an unsustainable reputational liability. The media system stopped protecting him when journalists like Julie K. Brown found editors willing to support exhaustive investigations of his past. Each of these systems operated according to its own logic. It responded to its own incentives and changed at its own moment when conditions warranted. But perhaps the most honest answer is that the system never actively protected him in the sense of coordinated defense. What the system did was not challenge him, which in practice amounted to protection. As long as it was not worth the cost of confronting him, Epstein enjoyed impunity that was indistinguishable from active protection. When that calculus changed, when confronting him became safer than not doing so, the system moved with a speed that reflected the same logic of self-interest that had previously operated in his favor. No one betrayed him because no one had ever really been loyal to him. It simply stopped being convenient to keep him safe. This is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of the Epstein case. That protection of the powerful requires no conspiracy, only calculation, and that systems designed for justice can work perfectly well for those with resources to manipulate them, and that when those systems finally act against someone like Epstein, it is not necessarily because they have become more just, but because calculations have changed in ways that finally make justice convenient. The people who facilitated Epstein's crimes, who looked the other way while he abused young women, who accepted his hospitality knowing or suspecting what happened at his properties, and have mostly not faced significant consequences. Some have experienced public embarrassment and reputational damage. Others have managed to distance themselves enough to continue their careers without serious impediment. None has been prosecuted as an accomplice, despite multiple victims' accusations that adults besides Epstein and Maxwell directly participated in the abuses. This vacuum of accountability is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Epstein's legacy, the sense that, and even when the system finally acted, it acted incompletely, leaving untouched many who deserve to be touched. The Epstein case files, which include thousands of pages of court documents, some of which remain sealed, continue to generate revelations years after his death. Journalists and victims' lawyers have fought to make public documents that could reveal the names of Epstein's associates who participated in his crimes. Each revelation generates headlines, speculation, and demands for accountability that rarely materialize into concrete consequences. The case has become a kind of open wound in American culture, a constant reminder of the gap between the justice the system supposedly provides and the reality of how it functions when defendants are sufficiently rich and connected. Jeffrey Epstein died on August 10, 2019, at 66 years of age, in a cell at a federal jail in Manhattan. The circumstances of his death, which the medical examiner determined as suicide by hanging, remain the subject of controversy and suspicion. What is beyond controversy is the suffering he caused over decades to countless young women, the system that allowed him to operate with impunity for most of his adult life, and the transformation of conditions that finally made it possible for him to face consequences. His story is a reminder that power can protect almost anything until it stops doing so, and that when protection systems collapse, they do so not for reasons of principle, but for reasons of convenience, leaving in their wake questions that may never be fully answered, and victims whose suffering will never be fully repaired. The question that titles this investigation about who betrayed Jeffrey Epstein may now seem poorly framed. There was no betrayal in the traditional sense, a discreet act of disloyalty by someone who owed him fidelity. What there was a change in the conditions that made his protection viable. When those conditions changed, when the cultural climate transformed, when public pressure became unsustainable, when the costs of protecting him exceeded the benefits, the system that had kept him safe simply stopped working in his favor. He did not need a traitor because he had never had true allies, only people whose self-interest temporarily aligned with his. In that sense, our Jeffrey Epstein was a victim of the same system he had exploited for decades, a system where loyalty is transactional, where protection depends on cost-benefit calculation, where even the most powerful are vulnerable when conditions shift in ways they cannot control. He understood that system better than most, manipulated it with extraordinary skill for most of his life, and in the end discovered its limits in the most definitive way possible. The system did not betray him, and it simply stopped finding him useful. And in a world where a person's value is measured by their utility to other powerful people, that was enough to seal his fate.